Chapter 9 of Lud-In-The-Mist. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Nicole J. LaBeouf. Lud-In-The-Mist by Hope Mirrlees. Panic and the Silent People. The following morning, Captain Mumchance rode off to search Miss Primrose Crabapple's academy for fairy fruit, and in his pocket was a warrant for the arrest of that lady, should his search prove successful. But when he reached the academy, he found that the birds had flown. The old rambling house was empty and silent. No light feet tripped down its corridors, no light laughter wakened its echoes. Some fierce wind had scattered the crabapple blossoms. Miss Primrose, too, had disappeared. A nameless dread seized Captain Mumchance as he searched through the empty, silent rooms. He found the bedrooms in disorder, drawers half opened, delicately tinted clothing heaped on the floor, indicating that the flitting had been a hurried one. Beneath each bed, too, he found a little pair of shoes, very down at heel, with almost worn-out soles, looking as if the feet that had worn them must have been very busy. He continued his search down to the kitchen premises, where he found Mother Tibbs sitting smiling to herself and crooning. "Now, you cracked harlot," he cried roughly, "what have you been up to, I'd like to know? I've had my eye on you, my beauty, for a very long time. If I can't make you speak, perhaps the judges will. What's happened to the young ladies? Just you tell me that." But Mother Tibbs was more crazy than usual that day, and her only answer was to trip up and down the kitchen floor, singing snatches of old songs about birds set free, and celestial flowers, and the white fruits that grow on the Milky Way. Mumchance was holding one of the little shoes, and, catching sight of it, she snatched it from him and tenderly stroked it as if it had been a wounded dove. "Dancing, dancing, dancing," she muttered, "dancing day and night. It's stony dancing on dreams." And with an angry snort, Mumchance realized, not for the first time in his life, that it was a waste of time trying to get any sense out of Mother Tibbs. So he started again to search the house, this time for fairy fruit. However, not a pip, not a scrap of peel could he find that looked suspicious. But finally in the loft he discovered empty sacks with great stains of juice on them, and it could have been no ordinary juice, for some of the stains were colors he had never seen before. The terrible news of the crabapple blossom's disappearance spread like wildfire through Lud-In-The-Mist. Business was at a standstill. Half the senators and some of the richer tradesmen had daughters in the academy, and poor Mumchance was besieged by frantic parents who seemed to think that he was keeping their daughters concealed somewhere on his person. They were all, too, calling down vengeance on the head of Miss Primrose Crabapple, and demanding that she should be found and handed over to justice. It was Endymion Lear who got the credit for finding her. He brought her, sobbing and screaming, to the guard-room of the yeomanry. He said he had discovered her wandering about, half frantic, on the wharf, evidently hoping to take refuge in some outward-bound vessel. She denied all knowledge of what had happened to her pupils, and said she had woken up that morning to find the birds flown. She also denied, with passionate protestations, having given them fairy fruit. In this Endymion Lear supported her. The smugglers, he said, were men of infinite resource and cunning, and what more likely than that they should have inserted the stuff into a consignment of innocent figs and grapes? "And schoolgirls being 1/4 boy and 3/4 bird," he added with his dry chuckle, "they cannot help being orchard thieves. And if there isn't an orchard to rob, why, they'll rob the loft where the apples are kept. And if the apples turn out not to be apples, why, then no one is to blame." Nevertheless, Miss Primrose was locked up in the room in the Guildhall reserved for prisoners of the better class, pending her trial on a charge of receiving contraband goods in the form of woven silk, the only charge, owing to the wilful blindness of the law, on which she could be tried. In the meantime, a couple of the yeomen, who had been scouring the country for Moonlove Honeysuckle, returned with the news that they had chased her as far as the Debatable Hills, and had last seen her scrambling like a goat up their sides, and no Doramarite could be expected to follow her further. A couple of days later the yeomen sent to search for the other crab-apple blossoms returned with similar news. All along the West Road they had heard rumours of a band of melancholy maidens flitting past to the sound of sad, wild ditties, and finally they had come upon a goatherd who had seen them disappearing, like Moonlove, among the folds of the terrible hills. So there was nothing further to be done. The crab-apple blossoms had by now surely perished in the elfin marches, or else vanished forever into fairyland. These were sad days in Lud-In-The-Mist. All the big houses with their shutters down, the dancing halls and other places of amusement closed, sad, frightened faces in the streets, and, as if in sympathy with human things, the days shortening, the trees yellowing and beginning to shed their leaves. Endymion Lear was much in request, especially in the houses that had hitherto been closed to him. Now he was in and out of them all day long, exhorting, comforting, advising. And wherever he went, he managed to leave the impression that somehow or other Master Nathaniel Chanticleer was to blame for the whole business. There was no doubt about it. Master Nathaniel these days was the most unpopular man in Lud-In-The-Mist. In the Senate, he got nothing but sour looks from his colleagues. Threats and insults were muttered behind him as he walked down the high street. And one day, pausing at a street corner where a puppet show was being exhibited, he found that he himself was the villain of the piece. For when the time-honored climax was reached, and the hero was belabouring the villain's wooden head with his cudgel, the falsetto voice of the concealed showman punctuated the blows with such comments as, "There, Nat Cock-o'-the-Roost, is a black eye to you for small loaves, and there's another for sour wine, and there's a bloody nose to you for being too fond of papples and airs." Here the showman changed his voice and said, "Please, sir, what are papples and airs?" "Ask Nat Cock-o'-the-Roost," came the falsetto, "and he'll tell you they're apples and pears that come from across the hills." Most significant of all, for the first time since Master Nathaniel had been head of the family, Ebenezer Prim did not come himself to wind the clocks. Ebenezer was a paragon of dignity and respectability, and it was a joke in Lud society that you could not really be sure of your social status till he came to wind your clocks himself, instead of sending one of his apprentices. However, the apprentice he sent to Master Nathaniel was almost as respectable-looking as he was himself. He wore a neat black wig, and his expression was sanctimonious in the extreme, with the corners of his mouth turned down like one of his master's clocks that had stopped at 7:25. Certainly a very respectable young man, and one who was evidently fully aware of the unsavory rumors that were circulating concerning the house of Chanticleer. For he looked with such horror at the silly moon face, with its absurd, revolving mustachios, of Master Nathaniel's grandfather clock, and opened its mahogany body so gingerly, and when he had adjusted its pendulum, wiped his fingers on his pocket handkerchief with such an expression of disgust, that the innocent timepiece might have been the wicked mayor's familiar, a grotesque hobgoblin tabby cat, purring and licking her whiskers after an obscene orgy of garbage. But Master Nathaniel was indifferent to these manifestations of unpopularity. Let mental suffering be intense enough, and it becomes a sort of carminative. When the news first reached him of the flight of the crabapple blossoms, he very nearly went off his head. Facts suddenly seemed to be becoming real. For the first time in his life, his secret, shadowy fears began to solidify, to find a real focus, and the focus was Ranulph. His first instinct was to fling municipal obligations to the winds and ride post-haste to the farm. But what would that serve after all? It would be merely playing into the hands of his enemies, and by his flight, giving the public reason to think that the things that were said about him were true. It would be madness, too, to bring Ranulph back to Lud. Surely there was no place in Doramere more fraught with danger for the boy these days than was the fairy fruit-stained town of Lud. He felt like a rat in a trap. He continued to receive cheerful letters from Ranulph himself, and good accounts of him from Luke Hempin, and gradually his panic turned into a sort of lethargic nightmare of fatalism, which seemed to free him from the necessity of taking action. It was as if the future were a treacly adhesive fluid that had been spilt all over the present, so that everything he touched made his fingers too sticky to be of the slightest use. He found no comfort in his own home. Dame Marigold, who had always cared for Prunella much more than for Ranulph, was in a condition of nervous prostration. Each time the realization swept over her that Prunella had eaten fairy fruit and was either lost in the elfin marches or in fairyland itself, she would be seized by nausea and violent attacks of vomiting. Indeed, the only moments of relief he knew were in pacing up and down his own pleached alley, or wandering in the fields of Gramarye. For the fields of Gramarye gave him a foretaste of death, the state that will turn one into a sort of object of art, that is to say, if one is remembered by posterity, with all one's deeds and passions simplified, frozen into beauty, an absolutely silent thing that people gaze at, and that cannot in its turn gaze back at them. And the pleached alley brought him the peace of still life, life that neither moves nor suffers, but only grows in silence and slowly matures in secret. The silent people! How he would have liked to be one of them! But sometimes, as he wandered in the late afternoon about the streets of the town, human beings themselves seemed to have found the secret of still life. For at that hour, all living things seemed to cease from functioning. The tradesmen would stand at the doors of their shops, staring with vacant eyes down the street, as detached from business as the flowers in the gardens, which looked as if they too were resting after their day's work, and peeping idly out from between their green shutters. And lads who were taking their sweethearts for a row on the Dapple would look at them with unseeing eyes, while the maidens gazed into the distance and trailed their hands absently in the water. Even the smithy, with its group of loungers at its open door, watching the swing and fall of the smith's hammer and the lurid red light illuminating his face, might have been no more than a tent at a fair where holiday-makers were watching a lion-tamer or the feats of a professional strongman. For at that desultory hour, the play of muscles, the bending of resisting things to a human will, the taming of fire, a creature more beautiful and dangerous than any lion, seemed merely an entertaining spectacle that served no useful purpose. The very noises of the street, the rattle of wheels, a lad whistling, a peddler crying his wares, seemed to come from far away, to be as disembodied and remote from the activities of man as is the song of the birds. And if there was still some bustle in the High Street, it was as soothing as that of a farmyard, and the whole street, houses, cobbles, and all, might almost have been fashioned out of growing things cut by man into patterns, as is a formal garden, so that Master Nathaniel would wander at that hour between its rows of shops and houses, as if between the thick green walls of a double hedge of castellated box, or down the golden tunnel of his own pleached alley. If life in Lud-In-The-Mist could always be like that, there would be no need to die. End of chapter 9.